I have to cover this. There's no way I'm not going to talk about this. And I got a bunch of stuff I want to cover, so I'm probably going to be all over the place. I apologize. It's just the way I do videos. The point of this video is I have to shatter a lot of a bunch of the delusions that is inherent in the discussion and conversation and controversy over what Wizards of the Coast is doing with the open gaming license and the future of Dungeons and Dragons. Now, just in case it's necessary and people think I'm some kind of Wizards of the Coast shill or fanboy or defender, let me shatter that delusion, because I couldn't care less about Wizards of the Coast. Wizards of the Coast and Dungeons and Dragons could go bankrupt tomorrow. I couldn't care less. Wizards of the Coast and Dungeons and Dragons could have gone bankrupt 20 years ago. I couldn't have cared less, because I haven't bought a D&D product since 2nd edition. I own OD&D, Basic D&D, and 1st edition. I'm good. I'm covered. I still play OD&D, Basic, and 1st edition. So I have absolutely... I don't care what products Wizards of the Coast releases with Dungeons and Dragons. I haven't bought anything since 2nd edition. Actually, no, that's not true. Technically, I have, because I did buy the Planescape system and I did buy the Dark Sun system, which came out during 2nd edition, but they were discontinued anyway, and I never actually bought any of the Dungeons and Dragons books. So I haven't bought anything D&D related since the 90s. So again, I don't care what happens to Dungeons and Dragons. They could collapse tomorrow. I ain't gonna shed a tear. I haven't worried about the IP for 30 years. I'm good. Now, the first delusion I want to shatter is this delusion that Dungeons and Dragons is screwed because of what they're doing. Okay, Dungeons and Dragons isn't screwed, and I'll explain in a bit. It's not Dungeons and Dragons that are screwed. It's the third-party publishers that are screwed, and they know that they're screwed. That's why they're so upset over the changes of the open gaming license. That's why they're pissed, because their free ride is over. Their gravy train is done. The gravy train is done. The ability to piggyback off of the open gaming license is gone. See, a little bit of a history lesson. The reason the open gaming license was created in the first place was when Wizards of the Coast first bought Dungeons and Dragons and 3rd edition came out. They wanted to have D&D fans, like third-party publishers, create products and books to help supplement and tie in to the D&D brand. Third-party publishers would create supplements that linked to Dungeons and Dragons, or adventures that linked to Dungeons and Dragons. What happened was, over the years, these third-party publishers started abusing the open gaming license, and instead of creating products that linked to Dungeons and Dragons, they started creating products that benefited themselves, their own system, their own game, that had nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons. The OSR is a great example, is a prime example, the old school Renaissance. Now, the old school Renaissance started off by wanting to promote playing old school D&D. What happened was, the OSR today is all about selling their retro clone basic D&D. That's all it is. The OSR isn't about making publishing third-party books that link to Dungeons and Dragons. They're all about publishing books that benefit themselves. And now that free ride is over. Because I love this. I don't care about Wizards of the Coast, but apparently Wizards of the Coast are the big bad guys, because they're telling these third-party publishers, if you're going to abuse the open gaming license and publish books that don't even link to Dungeons and Dragons and benefit yourselves, we want a cut of the royalties. And these third-party publishers are going, that's not fair. How dare Wizards of the Coast demand a portion of royalties for us using their open gaming license? How come that's not pointed out? How come that's not discussed? Why is it? Explain to me why Wizards of the Coast are the bad guys for telling third-party publishers who are abusing the whole point of the open gaming license to go, you know what? If you're gonna use the open gaming license to benefit yourselves, we want to cut. Why are they the bad guys? Why? And besides, if you're a third-party publisher and your system is so amazing, why are you even using the open gaming license? Create your own system. Problem solved. Problem solved. If you don't like the open gaming license, if you don't like the changes that are making to the open gaming license, stop using the SRD. Just create your own system. Problem solved. So what's the issue? Again, why isn't that discussed? Why isn't that being covered? Because the whole point is these third-party publishers are reliant on the SRD to actually have the gaming systems and books and modules that they have in the first place. Because if they tried to create their own gaming system, their own tabletop role-playing game, nobody would care. Nobody would buy it. The reason people are actually buying these third-party publishers' books is because they're using a system that is basically almost universal. So why is Wizards of the Coast the bad guys for going, we want a cut of you using our SRD in the first place? But in regards to the fact that why Dungeons and Dragons isn't screwed because of this is because in the history of Dungeons and Dragons, what they're doing with the open gaming license, that is nothing. That is pittance compared to some of the screw ups they've gone throughout the history of Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, take second edition. Dungeons and Dragons changed second edition to appease the religious right and the satanic panic screw up that happened. And they literally changed how the game was presented, and so that they could, have the books available in bookstores. And they literally neutered the game. And it almost destroyed the game. Almost destroyed Dungeons and Dragons. Guess what? Wizards of the Coast came in, bought Dungeons and Dragons, said, hey, you don't like second edition? Hey, here's third edition. Guess what? Dungeons and Dragons was back up again. Then fourth edition comes along. Oh, not even that. Before even that. Then we have third edition. What was it? 2 or 3 years later, after Wizards of the Coast established third edition, you want to know what Wizards of the Coast did? They went, yeah. All of you who bought third edition, 3.5. Everybody, all of the D&D fanboys who had bought in third edition books and spent hundreds of dollars on the core books and the supplements and the modules and the adventures, Wizards of the Coast goes, yeah, you know what? Screw it. You got to buy it all over again. You think that should have ruined Dungeons and Dragons. And what happened? The fanboys went, yeah, okay, we'll just buy 3.5. We'll just buy 3.5. They literally, after 2 years, went, yeah, we're going to change the system and you have to buy all of the books all over again. You think changing the open gaming license is going to destroy Dungeons and Dragons? You're out of your minds. You're delusional. Then we have 4th edition, when they changed the rules entirely, and the majority of people hated it. They hated 4th edition. What did Wizards of the Coast do? They went, oh, okay, you don't like 4th edition? Okay, here's 5th edition, which is a rehashing of 3.5. And guess what? everybody bought Dungeons and Dragons again, and it was great. Like, Dungeons and Dragons has gone through screw ups that make what they're doing with the open gaming license pale in comparison. But you guys have this delusion that that's gonna somehow break and destroy Dungeons and Dragons? You're out of your minds. If you think D&D players are pissed over what's going on with the open gaming license, you should have heard how D&D players were pissed over 3rd and 3.5. You should have heard how pissed people were over 4th edition. They were claiming how 4th edition was going to destroy Dungeons and Dragons. Guess what? Didn't do a thing. Didn't do a thing. Sorry, hate to break your delusion, but Dungeons and Dragons is not going to die off because of the open gaming license change. The only thing that's going to die are the third-party publishers. Oh, and here's another delusion. The open Dungeons and Dragons is the #1 tabletop role-playing game because of third-party publishers and the open gaming license. Let me shatter that delusion. Because before 3rd edition, before the open gaming license even existed, so the time period when there was OD&D, Basic Dungeons and Dragons, 1st edition Dungeons and Dragons, and I'll even include 2nd Dungeons and Dragons. During that time period, before the open gaming license, what was that era of Dungeons and Dragons ranked in regards to the tabletop role-playing games? I believe they were #1 worldwide. So before the open gaming license even existed, Dungeons and Dragons was the #1 role-playing game in the world. Yet somehow you guys have this delusion that the open gaming license was what allowed Dungeons and Dragons to be the #1 role-playing game when they were already the #1 role-playing game. So no, I hate to break it to you. The open gaming license and third-party publishers was not what made Dungeons and Dragons the #1 role-playing game in the world. Dungeons and Dragons made Dungeons and Dragons the #1 role-playing game in the world. It had nothing to do with you third-party publishers, and it had nothing to do with the open gaming license. Sorry. Here's another thing. Explain to me how third-party publishers releasing a material that has absolutely no link to Dungeons and Dragons somehow benefits Dungeons and Dragons. Explain that to me. How come that's not covered or discussed? Because you have third-party publishers that are releasing material that has absolutely no connection to Dungeons and Dragons. Yet for some reason, you're pretending, or you have this delusion that somehow benefits Dungeons and Dragons. How? So explain that to me. Go ahead. I'd love to hear it. But for some reason, you don't seem to cover that issue. You don't seem to discuss that part. You don't actually explain how third-party publishers releasing material that has absolutely nothing, no connection to Dungeons and Dragons somehow benefits Dungeons and Dragons. Now, granted, there are third-party publishers that do release material that is directly linked to Dungeons and Dragons. The thing is, Wizards of the Coast is going, we don't need you anymore. Yes, there are certain third-party publishers releasing material directly linked to Dungeons and Dragons, but there are a lot of third-party publishers that are abusing the open gaming license. And Wizards of the Coast is going, there's no sum gain. There's no sum gain in keeping the open gaming license the way it is. Like out of curiosity, what does Wizards of the Coast lose by changing the open gaming license? Nothing. They don't lose. The third-party publishers lose. That's who lose. But for some reason, that part of the discussion, that aspect of the issue and the controversy, that doesn't get covered. That doesn't get mentioned. It's not the third-party publishers that are screwed. It's the fans who are screwed because of the lack of material that's available. Well, sorry, Wizards of the Coast doesn't gain anything by third-party publishers' material. So, but for some reason, you have this delusion that Wizards of the Coast should keep the open gaming license the way it is, not for their benefit, but for the benefit of the third-party publishers. Like, how do you think businesses run? Like what? Again, you guys live in such a fantasy land. You don't need Dungeons and Dragons. You live in a fantasy land that makes Dungeons and Dragons seem plausible. It's ridiculous. But you know what? Let's go with that. Dungeons and Dragons is the number one tabletop role-playing game because of the open gaming license. Okay. What is Dungeons and Dragons' biggest competition? Please say Pathfinder, because here's the thing about Pathfinder. Pathfinder exists because of the open gaming license. I don't care what Paizo says in that statement that he did recently. I don't care what revisionist history he's pulling out of his ass. Because when first edition Pathfinder came out, you want to know what it was nicknamed? It was nicknamed 3.75. There was third edition, there was 3.5, and Pathfinder was classified as 3.75. Why? Because it was a direct derivative of 3.5. The whole idea that he only had the open gaming license or the SRD as a courtesy is absolute bullshit. It's pure bullshit. To even further establish the absolute bullshit and delusion of what Paizo was saying about how, because apparently Paizo was going, hey, we're establishing our own game version of an open gaming license. Isn't it a coincidence and interesting how Paizo introduced their version of an open gaming license only until after Wizards of the Coast established their changes to the open gaming license? Well, that's weird. Why didn't because according to Paizo, second edition Pathfinder, which came out, 2019, 2020? I can't remember exactly. Is its own gaming system. It's not beholden to the open gaming license. Well, if that's the case, why didn't Paizo establish his own version of the open gaming license when he released second edition Pathfinder? According to him, the whole point of an open gaming license is for the fans. It's to benefit the community. Well, if that's the case, why didn't you do that when you published second edition Pathfinder? If the open gaming license is such an invaluable tool for the gaming community, and it helps bolster the sales and support of your gaming system, then why didn't you establish your variation of an open gaming license when you released second edition Pathfinder? Why did Paizo literally give up 3 years of support to the Pathfinder IP by not having his variation of an open gaming license when he released Pathfinder second edition? Odd how he didn't do that. You don't get to go, oh, the open gaming license is essential to the gaming community, but I'm only going to create my variation of an open gaming license only after Wizards of the Coast decides that they're going to change theirs. Why isn't that discussed? Why isn't that being covered? Because the only thing anybody cares about is the fact that, oh, look, Pathfinder's allowing an open gaming license to their IP. So all the third-party publishers are going, great, a new IP we can mooch off of. But anyway, I digress. Back to what I was saying. Like I said, I'm all over the place when I do my videos. I apologize. But so let's go with Pathfinder. Pathfinder is D&D's biggest competition, based solely on the fact, well, not just on the fact, but because of the open gaming license and because 4th edition sucked so much that everybody hated it, that Paizo goes, hey, let's create a variation of 3.5, and everybody loved it, and whatever. So, according to you, According to all of you, the open gaming license benefits Dungeons and Dragons. Yet, it's because of the open gaming license that Dungeons and Dragons ended up creating its biggest competitor, Pathfinder. So even that logic doesn't work. Dungeons and Dragons would have been better off never having the open gaming license, because if without it, Pathfinder would have never existed, and there would have never have been, it never would have become such a major competitor to Dungeons and Dragons. So, sorry, your delusion of the open gaming license benefiting Dungeons and Dragons is broken in two different ways. Anyway, I've prattled on long enough because I doubt many of you have even made it this far in the video anyway, so there's really no point. But besides, I've said my piece. I got out of my system. I'm good. Sorry to have injected some reality into your delusions, but ain't nobody else gonna do it, so I have to do it. Because oddly enough, it's not popular to make videos calling out fan bases. They seem to hate it when you do that. I can't imagine why. Anyway, like I said, since nobody else was gonna do it, I had to. So because I'm here for you. I do this for you. It's just the kind of guy I am. Anyway, I'm out of here. See ya.